Hi everyone, in this video we'll be looking into the concept of carrying capacity and see how density independent or dependent factors influence a population from fluctuating near the carrying capacity but still keeping within the bounds. So carrying capacity, as we have defined in our previous video, it's essentially the maximum, like the population size of a certain species that the ecosystem can tolerate. And for a very short instantaneous period of time, yes, the population may increase beyond carrying capacity, or it may decrease below the carrying capacity. But again, this is very temporary, and usually the population, although it kind of fluctuates near carrying capacity, it stays within the bounds. So it is possible for the population to decrease or increase near the carrying capacity. However, ultimately, the population size returns to the carrying capacity. And usually the carrying capacity is reached when the resources in the environment, resources such as food, water, habitat, when all of these resources are used to its maximum, and these resources become quite limiting, that's when our carrying capacity is reached. And so if we were to draw a graph of how the population nearing and leveling off the carrying capacity would actually look like, we have our lag phase here, our log phase here, transitional phase, stationary phase. We've reached our maximum carrying capacity. The population would indeed fluctuate near this point, but again, you can clearly see that the population still does remain within near the level of the carrying capacity. So it does seem a little bit like a negative feedback loop as well. And there are many factors that can actually influence carrying capacity, not carrying capacity specifically, but how the population kind of works around carrying capacity and increases or decreases below that. And usually these factors are density dependent factors, and this is a concept that we're going to dive in right now: density dependent and independent factors. To elaborate a little bit more on what they are, density independent factors are essentially factors that are completely unrelated with the density of the population, and these factors generally have equal changes on the population regardless of the population size. So it doesn't necessarily depend on the size of the population, it's still pretty much going to have the same effect. Examples of this would be improving air quality, forest fires, etc. All of these are quite density independent factors. They don't necessarily depend on how much of the population we have. On the other hand, we have density dependent factors. And these are essentially just factors that cause different changes to the population, and it is again dependent on the original size of the population. So it is indeed possible that a density independent factor might cause an increase in the population size for a very short amount of time, but again, it would again be lowered by the density dependent factors, because density dependent factors ultimately depend on the population. Examples of density dependent factors would be kind of like competition, competing for a limited amount of resources. Those would be density dependent factors, etc. And so we can kind of see that density dependent factors kind of act as a regulatory mechanism of restoring the original population size through a negative feedback mechanism. So that is our density dependent factor. If I had to cite an example of how this might actually look like in application, I would say that if the air quality of a specific environment were to improve, it functions as a density independent factor, and it is ultimately going to increase population size. However, if the population goes beyond the carrying capacity, the population density factors will kind of come into action, and competition or even predation or even disease, all of which are density, population density dependent factors. All of these would be coming into action, and that would cause the population to decrease again and kind of stay within the bounds of the carrying capacity. And that's pretty much it in terms of how these density independent and density dependent factors can act as regulatory mechanisms for ensuring that the population keeps within the bounds of carrying capacity.